Hello, everyone. My name is Sophia Alvarado, and today I'll be presenting my thesis, Prosecuting White Power, How White Identity Influences the U.S. Judicial System. And I've been looking forward to this, so let's begin. In 1984, 9 white supremacists were acquitted of murder in the Greensboro Massacre. In 1988, 13 white supremacists were acquitted in the Fort Smith sedition trial. And though each of these may be perceived as isolated events, they are indicative of a larger structural, institutional problem: how the United States judicial system responds to the crimes of white power actors. And these examples are instances of an American legal response that has historically minimized the threat posed by white power actors. The goal of my research was to understand why. So, considering the power of the American legal institution and preliminary curiosity regarding its response to the white power and black power movements, I was eager to understand what role identity, specifically whiteness, played in the judicial response to white power and black power actors. So with the support and guidance of my advisor, Dr. Jeremy Menchik, I embarked with the fundamental research question: how does white identity influence the US judicial system? Now, moving to methodology, I started with a comparative historical analysis of archival data, gathering information on charges, convictions, and sentences starting in 1970 to create a holistic understanding of the judicial response to actors from the white power movement and the black power movement. In total, I acquired information on 334 white power actors and organizations, 185 black power actors and organizations, and 86 crimes under which the actors were tried. Using selected criteria, whether or not it was a criminal case, parity between actors for crimes, charges, and convictions, I narrowed the data down to 50 white and 59 black power actors. And after obtaining this data, I began a quantitative analysis to examine disparities using an inductive approach, comparing judicial responses between white actors and black actors. Now, following this analysis, new questions emerged regarding the nature of identity. Why have white power actors received life sentences less frequently than black power actors? Why have more black power actors been extrajudicially killed than white power actors? And how does identity motivate a drastically different judicial response? So I began seeking answers to these questions as I conducted literature review, focusing on the ideas of institutional racism, institutional white supremacy, and national hegemonic identity. So starting with institutional racism, I'd like to give the following example. In 1969, 3 civil rights workers were murdered by KKK members. The state of Mississippi failed to indict those members. The murder of these civil rights workers was an act of individual racism, but Mississippi's failure to indict these members was an act of institutional racism. So in taking an approach that centralized institutional racism, I sought to highlight the strength of institutions in operating as sites of white supremacy while reproducing white supremacist ideology. Now here, white supremacy refers to the system of oppression comprising a variety of institutions, including the American legal system, that naturalize white people as the dominant group in society, perpetuating the ideology of white power. With respect to how white supremacy operates within institutions, we can look to historical examples like legislation that banned interracial marriage until 1967, or the slow ratification of the 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery. Now, historically, white supremacy has operated in tandem with institutional racism and continues to assert itself today in a variety of ways. Both institutional racism and white supremacy are tied to identity through the idea of national hegemonic identity. Now, during the state-building process, certain identities can become hegemonic by being deep-seated and unquestioned. For the United States, this process occurred with white identities. Now, the belief of whiteness as the hegemonic identity constitutes a presupposed natural order for the population, and when it interacts with race prejudice, it creates self-assurance in the dominant group that they are naturally superior, all of which compounds to reinforce institutional racism and white supremacy by dictating the response of the superior group, white actors, to the inferior group, black actors. Something which I argue serves as the sociological indication behind the disparity in judicial responses to the white power movement versus the black power movement. So, taking all of that in, here is some of what I found. Now, looking at Table 1, there's a clear disparity in sentences received by each actor. White power actors were acquitted by a larger percentage than black power actors, and black power actors received life sentences by a larger percentage than white power actors. Now, interestingly, white power actors received the death penalty by a larger percentage than black power actors. However, roughly 8% of black power actors were extrajudicially killed by police, while 0% of white power actors were. Now, turning to Table 2, what's most striking here is how the sentencing data changes for white actors versus black actors. Looking at sentences between 0 and 10 years, 56% of white actors received these sentences, while 20% of black actors did. For sentences of 91 to 100 years, 40% of black actors received this length, while 8% of white actors did. However, for sentences greater than 100 years, white power actors received this sentence more than black power actors did. And while this is surprising, it does not include the 8% of black power actors that were killed extrajudicially by police. So at the end of my thesis, I ultimately argue that there is a skewed US judicial response towards white supremacy. For examples of this, we can look at the data, and you can read my thesis. This research provided quantitative evidence that white power actors see significantly shorter sentences than black power actors, and that this discrepancy cannot be explained by actor behavior. The implications of this knowledge being that justice is not blind in the United States, and that black power actors are punished in a way that white power actors are not. This knowledge is therefore indicative of the role of whiteness and its placement as the national hegemonic identity in the United States, alongside the larger issues of institutional racism and white supremacy in the American legal system. So thank you all for your time, and special thanks to my advisor, Dr. Jeremy Menschik, my panelists, Dr. Jessica Stern and Spencer Piston, as well as the BU Year-Out program and Kilachand for sponsoring this project. Thank you. All right. Jackson.
So I had a question. I don't know if this is something that you dived into, but in looking at the differences in sentencing, were you able to think about or determine if this was due to like different, say, legal strategies pursued by the prosecution, or due to like differences in like what the jury actually gave in terms of that?
So that wasn't necessarily data that I was able to access in how I approached this project. But what was interesting is that if you look at different historical examples, you'll see that, for example, in LaFort Smith's sedition trial that I talked about, that was an all-white jury that acquitted those 13 white supremacists. So there are instances of how like legal tactics and how different jury makeups might indicate different responses, but that wasn't something that I had access to in my research.
I'm curious if you saw much change over the historical period you studied. I think we have this sense that like our country is always improving, but maybe that's not evidenced in the research you saw.
So what was interesting is that a lot of, or the instances where black power actors had been killed extrajudicially, that was happening in more recent history as opposed to in the past. And so I think as well, you see like historically there are more white power actors that get acquitted or get sentenced to lesser times. And that sort of tends to shift as you move through history, but it's replaced by the fact that more black power actors are prohibited from due process because they're being killed extrajudicially and they never make it to that process.
I was wondering if you noticed any regional differences across the United States, or was it like pretty uniform?
So I, again, wasn't looking at sort of necessarily how things were happening state by state. That was just a little bit too granular for the approach that I took. But it is something that can be explored in further research.
Could you say a little bit about how you define black power and white power?
Right. So for my definition of the white power movement, I'm using the definition that comes from the historian Kathleen Belew. And that basically just discusses the white power movement as this amalgamation of white power actors and organizations that begins in the 1970s and has persisted till today. For the black power movement, it's interesting because that was born out of like the broader black liberation movement, and it was on the tail end of the civil rights movement. And so I'm defining it and using it in the way that the state does, in terms of like examining how the state was approaching these movements. But I've also recognized that they're born out of incredibly different things. For example, the white power movement was born out of, in part, an existential threat to whiteness in the United States, whereas the black power movement was born out of an existential threat to blackness because of things like economic and racial injustices.